Hello, genealogists. This is Craig, and this is Just Genealogy. And we continue with Chapter 2 of Genealogy as Pastime and Profession. Chapter 2, Puritan Peccadilloes. It begins with a quote by Leonard Bacon. O God, beneath thine guiding hand, our exiled fathers crossed the sea, and when they trod the wintry strand, with prayer and psalm they worshipped thee. And then a second quote by Leslie Mason. Our forefathers sought the wilderness and overcame it, but the wilderness, in surrendering, entered into them, and they became a part of them, and we are the heirs and the victims of that conquest and its consequences. One of the chief delights of genealogical research is the insight it gives us into the motives, the customs, the daily manner of life of people who lived in a different epoch. For close as our colonial ancestors are to us in generation sequence, and though removed but 2 or 3 centuries in time, they lived in a different world from our own. We cannot hope to do more in a short chapter than to tease the reader with hints of the sort of things he may stumble upon if he once acquires the interest to begin digging into the archives for himself. It has been said that the Puritans were deficient in humor. The Puritan of the Old English story who named his dog Moreover after the dog in the scriptures, and moreover the dog came and licked his sores, displayed an almost incredible literalness. The story may be apocryphal. But it is true that wit, like gaiety, was not encouraged. The youth who, after rescuing his cow from a bog, told her to go her way and sin no more, was fined for his blasphemous misuse of Holy Writ. Yet it must not be supposed that the Puritans were entirely without a spark of fun. The trouble is that we do not see them in their playful moments. It is only when some prank is carried too far and the practical joker summoned into court that the documents record anything of this nature. The story of Foote's Negro in a case in point. Nathaniel Foote of Branford, Connecticut, one Sabbath morning bribed his Negro to seat himself in the pew of Mr. Maltby, a wealthy merchant. It is not difficult to picture the scene. The meeting house is already well filled. Mr. Maltby, waiting for the service to begin, sits in his pew, which, because of his social position, is close to the pulpit. A tall, full-blooded African stalks solemnly up the central aisle, where members of his race are not permitted. All eyes are focused on him as he unsmilingly progresses towards the front of the house. The hushed expectancy is broken by scarcely audible murmurs of horror as he calmly seats himself beside Mr. Maltby. Boys titter in the gallery. Everyone in the house realizes the humor of the situation. Only the force of habit restrains the congregation from the wildest disorder. Then Mr. Maltby angrily rises and motions the Negro out of his pew. The burly fellow hesitates, gets to his feet, and unruffled amidst the commotion he has caused, retreats down the aisle to his customary place. And the sequel? Inquiries, of course, are made after the service, and the Negro, because of his ignorance, is absolved of the blame. The real culprit, Nathaniel Foote, is summoned to appear before the magistrates and is fined for an action which, in the words of the record, was contrary to religion and a profanation of the Sabbath. It may be hoped that he did not regret his little joke, but considered it worth the amount of his fine. The austere seriousness of the genuine Puritan latter degenerated into mere morbidity. Demoniacal angels, reminiscent of the worst Etruscan atrocities, grimace from the borders of the old gravestones. The majority of the epitaphs are of the prepare for death and follow me variety. Occasionally, there is a quaint frankness, a queer twist of thought that is worthy of preservation. The epitaph of Dr. Isaac Bartholomew, who died in 1750, today hardly discernible, is traditionally ascribed to his wife. It reads, "He that was sweet to my repose hath now become a stink unto my nose. This is said of me, so it shall be said of thee." Evidently, the wife addresses her deceased husband in the first two lines, and he replies in the last two. Or read the cryptic epitaph of Cyrus Hotchkiss. Cyrus, though pleasant in his day, was sudden seized and sent away. Or that of Miley Gaylord, a 5-year-old child, soon ripe, soon rotten, soon dead, but not forgotten. The epitaph of a young bride reads, the saddest sight in all creation, a wedding turned to lamentation, a mourning groom in desperation. These epitaphs I can vouch for. The following was sent to me by a friend. Here lies the mother of 8. She might have had more, but now it's too late. The sense of humor has been defined as an appreciation of what is and what is not congruous. Can anything be more incongruous than these lines, used as an epitaph for a Connecticut youth who died on Long Island about 1781? Thoughtless he wandered from his native shore and laid his ashes in a hostile land. Those who view graveyards as gloomy places to be avoided can never experience the mingling of reverence and exultation felt by genealogical enthusiasts when at last they stand in front of a long-sought gravestone of a remote ancestor. Nor can they know the furtive delight of collecting curious epitaphs. Witchcraft in colonial times and the Salem delusion are subjects which possess a fascination for many historical students and are another evidence of Puritan literalness. But those who take a perverse satisfaction in writing of our witch-burning ancestors would do well to pursue their historical studies a little further. For witches were not burned in American colonies. The usual method of execution was to turn them off ladders, leaving them dangling by a rope noosed around the neck. Saul was not the first to seek aid of infernal agencies when he paid his famed visit to Endor. Nor will those who today crowd the offices of astrologers and soothsayers be the last. Belief in witchcraft antedates written history and in some form still influences the lives of millions. His Bible admonished him to permit no witch to live. In his day, witchcraft was considered a crime in all the enlightened countries of Europe, where often supposed witches were much more cruelty dealt with than in America. Religion and law alike impelled him to believe and to act on his belief. It has become the custom to deride our witch-haunted ancestors as the fanatical victims of an absurd delusion. It is manifestly unfair to condemn them and their contemporaries for failure to view witchcraft in the light of modern psychology. Every age is guilty of absurdities. What of the organized wholesale murder called war, or of the unscientific treatment of the insane and the vicious? Let us make sure that we ourselves do not live in glass houses before we hurl rocks at those of our ancestors. The explanation of witchcraft craze is very simple. Witchcraft existed 2 or 3 centuries ago solely because people believed it existed. An angry woman might give a neighbor a hateful glance or utter a half-veiled threat. It would be remembered, and misfortunes subsequently occurring would often be connected with it in the mind of the neighbor. Significance would be extracted out of mere coincidences, and entirely natural events would be attributed to the malignant agency of the suspected woman. These suspicions would be bandied about in whispers or even openly. Oftentimes, imaginative children or neurotic adolescents, overhearing the talk, would discuss the matter between themselves. There was a thrill in it, and they would shudder deliciously when they suspected witch passed by them or spoke to them. Sometimes susceptible youths of either sex became obsessed with the notion that the witch was persecuting them. They would, while tormented with such a delusion, see apparitions of the witch, wraiths created by their own overactive brains. In all this, their parents would see their previous suspicions confirmed. Formal complaint would be lodged against the witch. The afflicted children would be examined by the magistrates, a proceeding which had the unfortunate effect of magnifying their importance in their own eyes and of augmenting the aberrations of such of the children as in reality were afflicted by abnormal or subnormal mentality. Thus, usually without deliberate malice on the part of any person, the suspected witch might be brought to trial. It must be borne in mind that many of the accused were women of unconventional personality or of temperament peculiarities which occasioned the suspicion in the first instance. Some were of superior mentality and had ideas which were too advanced for the minds of their contemporaries. Others were of diseased mentality. Probably the extreme fear caused by examination, trial, and conviction destroyed what little mental balance some possessed. There is no doubt, explains a number of witches freely confessed their league with the devil and the evil deeds they had performed by preternatural means. Very few witches would have been executed in New England if conviction had fallen only on those who confessed or who had been seen in their own persons performing supernatural feats. These were the two kinds of evidence sufficient for conviction, in the opinion of the best judicial minds of that period. Unfortunately, those who presided at the trials in Massachusetts were satisfied to accept the evidence of apparitions of the accused upon the attestation of supposedly credible and reputable witnesses. The Salem craze reached the dimensions of mob hysteria, and many innocent victims suffered. The search for stigmata on the bodies of accused witches was a relic of the ancient superstitious belief that the devil could have carnal relations with women, but could not do so without leaving a mark. Since witches were as superstitious as their accusers, they sometimes underwent the water test at their own request in the belief it would prove them innocent. In several cases, sworn testimony exists that a witch cast into the water bound hand and foot swam like a cork. The water test was not highly regarded by portions of the clergy and magistrate. It should never be forgotten that the truly religious people were no more common in 1630 than they are today. To read the family histories, one would suppose that the founder of every American family crossed the Atlantic because of high religious convictions to secure freedom to worship God in the way his conscience dictated. Many motives brought our ancestors to these shores. Religion was one of them, but it only was one of several. Modern scholars place greater stress on economic motives. The landless Englishman could here become a landed proprietor and leave an estate to his offspring. This must have been a great inducement, since a great majority of the immigrants were of small property class. Great hardships the first comers did indeed endure, as those endured by soldiers in modern warfare, who stepped back into the primitive from the hearths of comfortable homes. The common people in England 300 years ago did not have what we would consider comfortable homes, and save only for danger from the Native Americans after permanent homes had been established, here they were often as well off as in their former homes in England. If well-to-do settlers missed luxuries they had known abroad, those of the poorer class could not have mourned for comforts they had never known. Conditions here were crude, and manners and speech were often coarse. Yet the English language was used in conversation, not differing very greatly from that heard today. If you, intelligent reader, think that this is a very obvious and unnecessary statement, have you ever read American historical novels? And do you recall the language used in the conversations? An historical novel of the year 1930 makes its 18th century characters talk thus. Know then that this is a private match between two very noted marksmen who are such rivals that I think they would be very gladly use one another as targets in a duel. Even last night at the tavern, they in their cups, I think it might have come to blows. But the squire, who is a rare wag at times and hath ideas one would never suspect, is so thick a noodle, bethought him of this. The words are English, but the language is not. No human being in the history of the world ever talked that language. It is a literary fiction intended merely to convey the impression that the person speaking lived some 200 years ago. 18th century writers affected a somewhat stilted literary style at times. They had to show off their education, but their conversation was as free and as easy as ours, and they usually employed the inelegant you was in place of you were. Americans in the 18th century did not say hath unless they lisped, and bethink was an anachronism which was used only jocularly or in inflated prose writing. There was a rhetoric, to be sure. High-sounding phrases are found in the Declaration of Independence and in Patrick Henry's most famous speech, but the common speech of the common man, aside from new words and a few gradual changes inherent in the use of language, was not notably different from what it is today. Some of our modern story writers who like to write of an earlier periods of history do, praise heaven, put plain English speech into the mouths of their characters. The rest still cling to that romantic tradition which insists that our heroic ancestors must use the vocabulary drawn from the King James Version of the Bible, combined with the anachronisms of Spenser in The Faerie Queene and the artificialities of the worst imitators of Alexander Pope. There are good writers among them when they write naturally. Why do some cling to an absurd convention which would have been laughed out of the novels years ago? These writers would gain much by going to the court records of the period they wish to write about and reading the testimony of witnesses, which is as close as we can get to the actual speech of people who lived 2 to 3 centuries ago. If they cannot conveniently do that, they can find diaries in the proper period in print, and there is a study in contrast which I should like to suggest. First, read Milton's Areopagita, his splendid defense of the freedom of the press. Despite a slight exaggerated style, a relic of euphemistic tradition, it is noble prose with ringing cadences. Then read Autobiography of Milton's younger contemporary and amanuensis, Thomas Elwood, written in plain, straightforward English. Whole paragraphs could be quoted from it, which, if one did not know differently, might have been written yesterday. Elwood was a Quaker, but aside from the thee in his sect, spoke the language of the common people, the language which our progenitors brought with them from England, and he wrote much as he must have talked, without straining for literary effect. When Paradise Lost was published in 1667, Dryden is reported to have said of its author, "This man cuts us all out." Can anything be more modern? In fact, the more we delve into the authentic records of the past, the more we are impressed with the resemblances rather than with the differences. The differences were almost entirely in external conditions, but the people of colonial days were human beings who thought, felt, and acted like ourselves, and they spoke the English language. So that is chapter 2 of Genealogy as a Pastime and Profession. And this is Craig at Just Genealogy. And we will continue with chapter 3 next week.